morning. Welcome to the session called Assessment of Native Housing Needs in Washington, State Findings and Lessons Learned. My name is Emily Grossman. I'm with the Washington State Department of Commerce, and I'm going to just let the speakers jump in. It sounds like the presentation will take most of the time. So Kevin Klingbeil, do you want to jump in now?
Sure, thanks, Emily. Hi, I'm Kevin Klingbeil, Managing Director of Big Water Consulting in Seattle, Washington. I've got with me here today Rachel Kramer from Big Water Consulting, a research associate, and Nancy Pindis from Urban Institute. And Urban Institute was one of our partners on this project. I'm going to dive right on into our presentation since time frames are limited. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. As the project is titled, Assessment of Native Housing Needs in Washington State, there's a much longer title for this project called the Assessment of Housing Needs of American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians in Washington State. And I'm going to give you a quick overview just of kind of the background, methodology, findings, and recommendations. I'm going to hit on each of those issues throughout the course of this presentation. The first thing I'm going to kind of get into is the project history and purpose. So Washington State in 2015 conducted a housing needs assessment, which didn't thoroughly address Native or tribal housing. So some of the more urban Native organizations sought a separate or supplemental project to kind of fill in those gaps. And so this project effectively was announced, and Big Water Consulting, in partnership with Urban Institute and Akana, an engineering and planning firm, were selected to partner and conduct this project. And it began in late January 2020, just in time for the pandemic to come along and throw a curveball at us. But I wanted to hit quickly on the purposes of this project, this undertaking. So it was really to evaluate the housing needs of three unique Native communities, as I mentioned, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities, and identify their housing needs and the barriers to housing development, to the creation of sufficient amounts of housing, but also to develop and provide some recommendations to reduce and eliminate those barriers. So leading into kind of a legal, philosophical, moral kind of issue is, why do Native housing needs matter? So, one of the starting points of that conversation, these are the original inhabitants of Washington State. And so they have, a particular place here and ownership with respect to this area. But where that's enshrined is in treaty obligations that the federal government took on when it entered into treaties with these sovereign nations. So, we start out kind of with that underpinning, and then we get into some of the issues that are specific to these communities as well. We have intergenerational trauma that was due in large part to a history of institutionalization, relocation of these communities, and assimilation practices. That were implemented through legislation, through different programs over generations. We have land loss and displacement. So obviously people are familiar with reservations. We had ordinances in Seattle that removed Native inhabitants from the city. We had displacement as a result of dams and flooding of lands even along the Columbia River, for example. There were earlier prescriptive housing programs that created poor housing conditions and housing stock that were related to earlier iterations of HUD programs and other things that developed the existing housing that we see on tribal lands today. So that is in part what created kind of stifled housing markets, in addition to what we'll talk about, which are trust land issues that are specific to tribal lands. It created an existing housing shortage, and again, poor housing unit condition. We also find in public housing, affordable housing settings, in home ownership settings, housing lending settings, that there's continued discrimination and disenfranchisement of these communities. So you can see that there's an array of different issues affecting Native communities that justify a particular study of and response to their housing needs. So just a quick introduction to Native and tribal housing for those who are not familiar. So obviously we have treaties and treaty rights that recognize these as sovereign nations. There's a government to government relationship between the federal government and tribes. That creates a distinction, though, for the urban nonprofit Native providers who are not, of course, tribal governments, and therefore, when we talk about the programs that apply to them, the funding sources that are available to them, not all of those things apply, and including the provision of tribal preference or Indian preference in providing services. One of the other issues for the three communities we're talking about here is that Alaska Natives, of course, are not in Alaska, so many of the services and opportunities available to them in Alaska are not available here. And similarly for Native Hawaiians, opportunities and rights that may attach in Hawaii are not available here, or don't attach here. In terms of funding issues, we'll talk a little bit again about census data and other data that drives funding levels for tribal communities and tribal programs, and issues that we see within census data in terms of pulling apart groupings of, for example, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, or American Indians and Alaska Natives, which creates challenges there. Another issue is the flatlining of funding for some of the larger programs, including the Indian Housing Block Grant formula, which is part of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, which is the act which sort of governs tribal housing. Land on tribe within reservations and tribal areas is held in trust, and thus, for those of you familiar with home ownership and mortgage lending, that creates its own issues in terms of collateral. Also creates other issues in terms of development of housing, whether trust land is available or if it has to be built on fee land, which then of course subjects tribes to other rules and laws, local, state, and other laws that wouldn't apply if it was on trust lands or within reservations. Many tribes experience kind of limited land to build housing, especially here in the Northwest, where we have some smaller reservations, smaller land bases, including some tribes that don't actually have reservations, they just have service areas. Homelessness is a very critical issue, especially in the urban areas, and then it manifests itself in a different way in tribal areas, generally in severe overcrowding or doubling up, because rather than let people live outside or outdoors, people take them into their homes, and with a housing shortage, that creates overcrowding. Severe economic distress in tribal areas leads to limited housing revenue for housing programs, and also stifles housing markets on reservation lands. We also see, when we examine data for urban Native communities, that their household incomes are much lower than median or average incomes in those areas. In tribal areas, we also see a much higher percentage of people living in managed housing than in private housing. So I won't go through the entire history. It would take me days to talk through the history of Native communities in this area. But just to say that it dates back over 12,000 years. And as many people are aware, over time we had the introduction of smallpox that wiped out large percentages of the population, as much as 90%. We had a series of treaties in the mid-1800s that ceded a large portion of Native lands to the federal government and established numerous reservations, which is, when we refer to the tribal lands, oftentimes what we're talking about are these reservations. The city of Seattle passed an ordinance in 1865 expelling and banning all Native Americans from the city. So when we talk about displacement, it's not just the reservation setting, it was excluding them from other areas. People are often familiar with the boarding school era, and the institutionalization and assimilation practices that took place during that period of time. We had the Indian Relocation Act, which encouraged thousands of tribal members to essentially leave their communities and move to large cities, including Seattle, where they really didn't understand and the budgeting and even legal systems, and didn't receive a lot of support. It was also at that time that several tribes were effectively terminated and lost their lands, and their members then were sort of scattered in urban and other areas. We had the flooding of tribal lands by the Columbia River dams and displacement of folks from their homes and fishing sites. But then we see this resurgence in 1970 where we have the occupation of Fort Lawton. Many people understand kind of that area as Discovery Park in Seattle. And we have the launching then of Chief Seattle Club, Seattle Indian Services Commission, the Seattle Indian Health Board, and United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, which is really kind of the core of our urban native providers here in the Seattle and King County area. We also see in the Bolt decision an affirmation or reaffirmation of treaty-based rights to harvest fish in common with the other citizens of the territory. In other words, tribes received effectively sort of half of the fisheries in this area. And then we, in furtherance of the self-determination era, which began around that time, we see the passage of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. So removal from the more general program into a very specific tribal housing program, which expanded tribal self-determination in determining how to spend those precious housing funds. And to this day, we still have several tribes that are not recognized by the federal government yet here in this area, and who are continuing to seek recognition. So the question would be sort of why now? Why would we do this particular study at this time? And as I mentioned, there had been a previous study in 2015 at the state level addressing housing needs more generally. It just didn't thoroughly address tribal or native housing, and its update following that in 2017 did not either. We did have a national study, which actually Nancy, who's our partner here today, was served as the principal investigator for with the Urban Institute, but it was conducted on behalf of HUD. So that was kind of addressing at a higher level the NAHASDA program and its effectiveness across tribes throughout the country. There was also the King County American Indian Alaska Native Housing Needs Assessment conducted by the Seattle Indian Services Commission that was completed in 2019. So we saw in that project kind of an assessment at the county level, but there was then sort of recognition that we needed to do something at the state level to address those needs more generally. And in this, during this time, we were also seeing kind of calls for equity at local and state levels in the programs that were being implemented by the various agencies and programs at those levels. So why is this important? Well, it's first of its kind here in Washington, and can serve as a model for other states and potentially even local governments to start to think about these needs in particular, and then of course evaluate their policies and programs with respect to Native communities. It also fosters and creates an opportunity for partnerships between local, state, federal, tribal, and even Native nonprofit entities, and an evaluation of the various policies and programs. And what we hope is improved services, in part because of that engagement and that connection that may not have been there, including at the various levels of government, which may not be looking at other levels in their programs. So what are the kind of core substantive and structural challenges here for a project like this? Well, as I mentioned, we have multiple unique Native communities within the study. So American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian. We have several distinct regions of the state. So, coastal and a Puget Sound I-5 corridor in Eastern Washington is one way to break it up, but obviously there are many other ways you can break up the geography here and the issues that the folks in those regions have. We have kind of urban native, kind of nonprofit organizations versus tribal. We have rural versus urban communities. We have variations in the tribal and organizational resources and capacity. So, for example, not all tribes have casinos that generate a lot of revenue. Not all tribes have access to the same kinds of urban services or even additional overflow housing in others around them. We have challenges of grouping of Native community members in existing data sets. So for example, you have Alaska Native and American Indian as American Indian Alaska Native within the census. And so trying to pull apart those communities within reporting of that data can be challenging. You have Native Hawaiian linked to Pacific Islander. And so trying to examine those communities specifically within data sets can be challenging. And then we just have an entirely kind of wide-ranging set of service providers, agencies, funding sources, and allies that are serving each community. So trying to take that apart and making sure that they're all stakeholders in this process is critical. And then obviously you have kind of the COVID disruption kind of that affected anyone trying to do this sort of work during this period of time. So who are kind of the Native and tribal communities in Washington? Well, not everyone understands that there's 29 federally recognized tribes here, in addition to those that I mentioned that were not yet federally recognized. We have a population of just over 313,000 American Indian Alaska Native alone, or what they call in combination with other races. So if they select more than one box on the census for race. So that's about 4.1% of the Washington state population, which puts it at the 10th largest American Indian Alaska Native population by state. So diving right into tribal communities and what we call TDHEs, which are tribally designated housing entities. These organizations, they maintain housing on reservation land and often have existing subsidized housing. So that is a distinction. If they have housing that preceded the Nahasa statute in 1996, they receive continuing subsidies for that housing and not for housing that's developed after that. Then the operation and maintenance of their housing is constrained by underfunding of the Indian Housing Block Grant and other federal programs. And I say that, it's a subjective statement, but as you can see from the graph that I put on here, the buying power and the value of those dollars that are provided has declined significantly over time because of that flatlining when you take into account inflation and other costs. And then it's important to understand that new development and housing finance on tribal lands is constrained by trust land restrictions. Again, like I said, trust land being held in trust can't be used as collateral, for example, in housing financing. There's high infrastructure costs in many cases because these are rural areas and remote areas. And then, it may come as a surprise, but even on some of the larger reservations, depending on how land has been leased and limitations on where you can build, there can be a lack of buildable land that is still available, that is tribal land. In urban Native areas, there's often a lack of Native specific or culturally appropriate services, and other than those that are provided by Native nonprofit organizations like the Chief Seattle Club pictured there. They contend with high rents and land prices in urban areas, especially obviously in the Seattle area and the surrounding area, which then shifts their communities to kind of fringes of these areas away from community spaces and services. So when we talk a little bit about that relocation to urban areas, creating kind of isolation from their communities and from each other, that can further that problem. And then there's restrictions on the application of Indian preference and the use of federal funding. So unlike tribal programs, which are able to apply Indian preference and to some extent even tribal preference, urban Native organizations, if they're providing services, for example, have to generally offer them up at large and hope to market their services to Native peoples in order to be able to serve them more specifically. Alaska Native communities are, of course, outside of their tribal village or corporation service area, which means they have limited access to services provided through federal or tribal programs. But it is, they do have some access to those programs, especially when they are provided to what they call sort of members of federally recognized tribes, and they're acknowledged that way in those programs. And then there are, of course, some nonprofit organizations that serve Native people at large that Alaska Natives can receive those services. These communities can be difficult to measure and provide services to because most data collected aggregates Alaska Native and American Indian populations. So getting a handle even on how many people, Alaska Native members of the community are there can be challenging. And it can be challenging to organize outside of a specific tribe or village. So for example, Tlingit and Haida has a large presence in Seattle and can provide certain services, but may not be able to sort of bring together folks from different tribes or villages or be able to provide services to them. Native Hawaiians, again, don't have specific right or access to services as Native Hawaiians in Washington, so they're using public services, public housing, for example. Similar data collection challenge aggregating Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So trying to pull them out from larger data sets can be challenging, and distinguishing them from that larger group. Again, can be challenging to organize them outside of community-based events and gatherings. But it's important to acknowledge that we have a fairly large population of Native Hawaiians in Washington at around 28,000, which is 0.4% of the Washington population. So in terms of methodology, one of the challenges here is that traditional housing data sources are typically unreliable for Native or tribal populations. So just as an example, in 2010, the census itself documented that American Indians and Alaska Natives living on reservations were undercounted by about 4.9%. Data that we pulled together was compiled from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, from HUD, USDA Rural Development, Census, ACS, and PUMS, and American Housing Survey data, and then HMDA data, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. So pulling together from those sources and sort of evaluating and determining the relevance and application to the various communities that we're talking about. We also supplemented this with original data collection in the form of surveys, focus groups, and interviews. So surveys with housing providers, as well as professionals that support them, focus groups of these various stakeholders in our project, and interviews with knowledgeable sources, including agency staff. So some of the changes due to COVID-19, we were planning as part of this outreach to attend the NAIHC, the National American Indian Housing Council annual convention, as well as regional tribal housing meetings and meetings, for example, of ATNI, the regional group of organization for tribes. Weren't able to do those because those events were canceled. Couldn't do direct visits to tribes and reservations due to safety concerns. We're hoping to do community-based focus groups, for example. We ended up shortening the survey that we provided at a later date to reflect kind of lower capacity within housing organizations and reduce staffing levels. So those were just a few of the ways in which we had to adapt this project for COVID. So in terms of findings, I'm going to gloss right over this a little bit because of the report that will be released here very soon covers 100+ pages and kind of pulls together all of these various data sources. Like I said, in terms of primary and new data collection, existing data, but really kind of the themes we wanted to give you to take away from this is we have very high rates of cost burden in terms of overall housing expenses and cost of housing itself, and that varies obviously among Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native, American Indian, both urban and tribal communities, but these are themes that we sort of identified across the various communities. Higher rates of overcrowding, for example, in their housing, higher rates of home loan denial, which obviously kind of relates both to economic and income related circumstances, but also the discrimination that we were talking about before. lower rates of home ownership, less adequate housing, and higher rates of homelessness. And many of these things, as I mentioned, may not come as a surprise to folks who are familiar with tribal or native housing issues, but what I would suggest is visiting the report that we're producing, and also I'll give you a web page at the end to see the more in-depth presentation we provided containing this data, so that you can see more specific details, more specific data sources to back this up. I'll quickly hit on some opportunities and successes that we identified for tribally designated housing entities. One of the opportunities here is to develop relationships with state and local officials to navigate institutional and cultural barriers. So we were really finding that there was a willingness on the part of these different agencies to start to kind of bridge the gap and identify that maybe not enough work had been done to engage these tribal and native organizations. There's an opportunity to participate in continuum of care programs now that legislation has changed to include tribal programs and tribes and tribal programs, and also to participate in point in time counts to ensure that tribal members and residents of native communities are accurately counted. Expansion of the tribal HUD-VASH program for veterans, so the Veterans Assistance and Supportive Housing. That program has recently been expanded to include more tribes and increased funding for that program, whereas before it was sort of limited to a certain number of tribes. Leveraging low-income housing tax credits in combination with other funding programs. So there were many tribes that kind of referenced that they weren't necessarily going to be able to participate in this program due to limited amount of operating subsidy or operating funding. And so there's different opportunities for them to engage, pull in other sources of funding for that. We're also finding that the willingness of the Washington State Housing Finance Commission to at least evaluate its process for allocating specific tribal points was a very positive development, and again shows the willingness of these agencies to reevaluate their approach. Title VI, the program can be leveraged with Section 184 or USDA Section 502, and that's Title VI allows you to essentially obtain an amount of funding up to several years of your grant allocation in advance to be able to develop housing, and that can be used then to serve these two programs that are listed here, which are home loan guarantee programs offered by HUD and with USDA. So providing some funding for that. And then the Section 184, which is the home loan guarantee program, had a lending limit increase, which then allows folks to actually get loans in the Seattle area and other areas where before the lending limit was so low that it essentially rendered that impossible to do. And then, using data to develop long-term strategic plans to address transportation, education, health, utilities, environment. Part of that is looking at the data that is coming out and through other regional planning processes. So we'll talk about, the importance of engaging tribes in regional and county level planning of housing and transportation, education, and health, because what we were finding in some of our studies is that they were either not invited or excluded from some of these processes. And then there's a real emergence of home ownership programs, either through tribal housing programs or community development financial institutions, CDFIs, to promote and expand home ownership classes, loan programs, financial literacy, home maintenance education, and other opportunities for homeowners. In the urban areas and with urban providers, we were finding that the Coalition to End Urban Indigenous Homelessness, in its advocacy and along with its member organizations, had helped produce an update in the HMIS system in King County to include Native identification or affiliation. which is sort of beginning down the road of being able to allow urban organizations to help reach out and target Native community members and provide services directly to them. There's also potential for urban providers to work with tribes to house tribal members using the HASDA funding or other tribal funds, which would, when those funds are used, would allow them to apply Indian preference. Native-led urban providers have higher housing retention rates. So we will cite in a later slide some examples of success, including Eagle Village and some other projects here in the Seattle and King County area where we are seeing higher retention rates, which demonstrates that these programs can achieve results, if they're properly funded. And then we've seen some city funding here in Seattle allocated for Native housing development or housing that will provide services and related services and housing for Native communities here, including the Sacred Medicine House that was developed in cooperation with Chief Seattle Club, and Fort Lawton redevelopment, which brings in United Indians as a partner in that project with Catholic Housing Services. So some recommendations for urban providers. One of the things that we're seeing is reevaluating how certain data sets are designed in order to make them more inclusive and helpful to Native entities. So expanding data collection beyond simply quantifying American Indian Alaska Native population and demographics to also assess individual and family connection to services and cultural resources. So there initially, obviously, the first step is to really allow people to identify that Native identification affiliation, and then start to ask them or allow them to identify whether they would like to connect to specific tribal programs or Native nonprofit programs in the area. Using those changes that I mentioned to the HMI system in King County, Seattle and King County, and identify opportunities to potentially include those changes statewide to expand the benefit of that change. Using the experience of Chief Seattle Club and its Native and non-Native partners to develop a roadmap for other urban Native organizations seeking to develop housing. So one of the things that we saw was that there was limited capacity in some of these smaller programs, but that certain programs had taken the lead and developed that capacity, and expanding kind of the sharing of that knowledge, and even the bringing of knowledge from other organizations like the Housing Development Consortium here in Washington State could be very valuable. Again, partnering with tribes that express interest in developing deeper partnerships with urban Native housing organizations so that tribal members living in cities can find housing and supportive services. So bridging that gap between the tribal and urban programs so that tribes don't have to wonder what's happening with their members in the city and hope that they're doing well, to make sure that there's a network, a closed kind of network that will allow them to be taken care of wherever they are. And then advocate for a creation of a Native and tribal committee at the state level for the Continuum of Care program and other Department of Commerce programs based on achievements in the Seattle area. So again, what we were finding was when we talked about Continuum of Care and even homeless counts, that you have different things happening for Native communities and potential opportunities in Seattle and King County, for example, than you would find in the state at large in the balance of state continuum of care. As you might imagine, kind of the opportunities and successes available and identified for the Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian communities are more limited just because of both their organization and the available services for them. What we did see was that there were opportunities for the Alaska Native regional corporations to provide some support to members. At this point, no housing specific support due to, frankly, some complications within the kind of corporate structure, but potential opportunities down the road. There's efforts underway to expand services in Washington for Tlingit and Haida and by Tlingit and Haida. That could encompass other members of other tribes or villages. And then also we found a real willingness and actually kind of an effort by urban providers that are working to serve the Native Hawaiian community as well as the American Indian and Alaska Native communities. For example, Chief Seattle Club, Seattle Indian Health Board, United Indians, and others. So some additional issues to consider, and these were just issues that were raised by some of the respondents, some of the folks that we spoke with during the study. Some grantees discussed how grant processes favor organizations with experienced grant writers and prior history of success in the program, which of course then kind of stifles the efforts of other programs to take on those programs, provide those services, renovate homes, do things like that through community development block grants and other funding sources. Agency staff and tribes are often not aware of the various local, state, and federal programs, including how they complement each other or if they complement each other and whether tribes are even eligible or competitive for those programs. So, addressing the knowledge issue and awareness issue is critical. We did find that Washington State agency staff and Senate Housing Stability and Affordability Committee members, really demonstrated an interest in improving programs for and relations with tribes. And from various sources throughout the project, they acknowledged that Washington was ahead of most states in that regard. Tribal staff noted that the amount of reporting that was required for some grants is too burdensome in relation to the amount of money awarded. And so an adjustment of that to, they're already suffering kind of limitations in terms of capacity and staffing and turnover, so that exacerbates that issue. Also kind of noted that urban Native organizations and tribes can develop partnerships to build capacity and connections in areas of housing operation, maintenance, and development. And that's a critical issue because tribal housing entities oftentimes have 50+ years of experience doing this kind of work, whereas the smaller urban Native nonprofits are just getting into this world. And there's existing organizations like the Housing Development Consortium and others who have a tremendous amount of knowledge as well that could be brought to bear and maybe even add to that connection. So some lessons learned from this project and the process. Facilitating regional working groups among tribes and urban Native communities really can lead to capacity building relationships. So there are traditional entities that serve regional tribal groupings, and there's the divide sometimes between urban Native organizations and tribal organizations. And when we were grouping, say, tribes on the peninsula, tribes in Eastern Washington, and even sort of more local urban and tribal organizations, you start to see a lot of partnerships developing that can really lead to some positive things. We identified the need to adapt survey length and level of detail to adapt to the reduced staffing levels during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as you can imagine, when folks are rushing to serve their members and address these various funding sources that are available, filling out a lengthy survey was not at the top of their list, or engaging in a number of monthly meetings that we were holding. So we had to adapt to that. Many agencies and tribally designated housing entities did not have the data readily available or compiled for reporting purposes. So it just requires a greater lead time for that to allow them to compile that. So you can't take for granted that all the things that you're looking for are going to be in an accessible format that they can simply pull and give to you. The importance of regular communication between stakeholders to learn about and address needs was really something that was valuable and allowed them to discuss issues, across the housing spectrum and also other sort of socioeconomic and geographic issues that allowed them to kind of commiserate, but also develop strategies to overcome different issues and then learn from each other. And then I think one other critical piece was just acknowledging the unique issues of these different Native communities and providing an explanation of project purposes and potential outcomes, and the required steps to properly engage them in the design of the project is really critical. And I say that, I include here, including budget determination, because when you're thinking about designing a study like this, initially it sort of seems like you're targeting a community, like the Native community. But in reality, as I was describing, what you have are multiple Native communities in different regions of the state with different levels of resources and even connection to neighboring communities and thus housing within those areas. And so it's really critical to be able to identify the structural nature of the project, but then also to be able to communicate to the stakeholders in the project what it is that you're actually seeking to accomplish and what you're going to do with that information. Because that's one of the challenging parts when conducting any study in Native communities where they've been studied to death, so to speak, and surveyed to death, as they will often say. The question is, what is going to happen as a result of this project? And of course, when you're conducting a study, you can't always answer that question, but it becomes a critical one. So I've provided some examples here of just different successes, success stories across urban Native and tribal communities. And I'm not going to go into detail on these because essentially out of time, but we provided links here. And so I'll also provide this presentation on a web page that I'll give you the address to in just a moment. And then you can just pull this presentation and click on the links and take a look at each of these different success stories. What you see here are with Chief Seattle Club, there are some urban Native housing projects that have either been developed or are in the process of development with city funding, tribal funding, and other funding sources. And then with the Makah tribe and Lummi Nation, Colville Indian Housing Authority, you see some projects that deal with supportive housing, you deal with veterans housing, and even with Muckleshoot, some uses of CARES Act funding to provide additional housing to address the concerns that were raised during that, the initial phases of the pandemic. You can see the Fort Lawton redevelopment is a partnership between United Indians with Catholic Housing Services as part of a larger redevelopment effort here again in our Discovery Park area. And then Nesica Alahi is a project in Oregon that we highlight in Portland, which is a partnership between a Native nonprofit organization, NAYA, and a tribe, the Siletz tribes, in which they're using those NAHASDA funds to allow for the provision of housing specifically to tribal members as part of a larger housing project where other units are not designated that way. So it's kind of a mixed funding, mixed use opportunity. So again, I won't go into the key takeaways, but these are things we cited earlier in terms of things that we identified within Native communities, evidence of housing need, evidence of those housing barriers, and the things that in the report, we provide some recommendations to hopefully reduce or diminish. I will mention these key takeaways that kind of came out of the project, which is, just to recommendation and things that we would recommend agencies and others consider, which is, incorporating Native tribal organizations and relevant processes and provide a seat at the table from the outset, not an afterthought, and don't make these organizations sort of beg to get into the process, but invite them and make them a critical part of the effort. Evaluate policies, laws, and local planning processes to ensure inclusivity of Native individuals and communities. And that's both in terms of the specific eligibility requirements, but also are you inadvertently creating thresholds that can't be met by those members of those communities or the communities themselves. Advocate for and provide sufficient levels of funding to address existing need and support self-determination in addressing that need in recognition of the demonstrated capacity to achieve results. So, don't not fund programs because you need them to build capacity when, in fact, if they had the funds, they could show you they have the capacity to spend them properly. Advocate for, provide designated funding sources for urban Native organizations and avenues for direct engagement and contribution to local and state housing and homeless programs. So again, recognizing the contributions and achievements of these organizations, as the city of Seattle has in providing funding dedicated to those projects, and making sure that these programs are integrated into homeless service provision and even data collection. So that's what I have. We can move. I know I've gone a little bit over. We can address some questions if anybody has them. You can see the address at the bottom of this page at nativehousingwa.org is where we will post the presentation and link to the report when it's available.
Thank you, Kevin, for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I don't know if we'll get to more than one of them. But the first one is, can you explain tribal points in the context of the tax credit allocations?
So Washington State Housing Finance Commission has what they call targeted area points that tribes are eligible for, and essentially the automatic eligibility would be a tribe that in its tribal area has a poverty level above 20%. So the Housing Finance Commission provides a list of the tribes that meet that threshold according to what should be American Community Survey data. And then if a tribe believes that it should be eligible based on other data or data that it has collected, then Housing Finance Commission allows for the submission of that data, or even for a sort of a consideration of whether the tribe should be eligible. And it at present it's 6 points within that process, and that would be in place of some of those the 7 points, I believe, that are for related to local services and amenities and things like that. So they can either get the other points or the tribal points. Nancy or Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Okay, let's do one more. What can non-native service providers in Seattle do to address these needs besides making partnerships with Chief Seattle Club and other Native community organizations?
Well, I think initially, I mean, a certain level of partnership may be necessary, just because when we talk about evaluating their programs and policies, it's trying to determine whether they are truly inclusive of these community members, and not inadvertently, for example, in the way they, even in the documentation requirements, things like that, inadvertently excluding members of these communities. So engaging with some of those other organizations that we listed, or at least members of those communities, would be helpful to have that perspective when evaluating those programs and policies. Nancy or Rachel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would just say that they could, maybe even without a formal partnership, really work with the Native urban organizations in terms of outreach and how they market the availability of any either services or housing units they may have.
Oftentimes, for example, if there's certain things available like housing choice vouchers, other things like that, where they could potentially allocate some of those, where the Native providers or Native community members could have those available to them, that can be very helpful. Also ensuring, that if there are, if they have specific funding available to maybe even, I mean, this is a partnership that we would be talking about, but some of these smaller nonprofit organizations that are serving Native community members may not independently have the capacity to do certain things, but could help those other organizations serve Native participants in their program in better ways. And so there can be opportunities for them to either come in and help, or for referrals to those programs to help better serve those people.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Kevin and Nancy and Rachel, for coming today and talking about your report. Thanks to all of you for attending, and that concludes this session.